met you, my name's Scott Swanson. I'm one of the pastors here at the Grove. So welcome again, everybody. Welcome again to those of you joining us via the interwebs. We're glad that you're here. And we are in this series called Embrace This Christmas. A couple weeks ago, we started this looking at the idea of embracing the miracle of Christmas. And then last week was the journey that we find ourselves on at Christmas. And today, we're looking at the idea of embracing the promise of light that came at Christmas. You can't go through Christmas, right, without lights just everywhere. I mean, they are clearly a part of Christmas. We decorate our trees in lights. We've got some here that are decorated in these lovely lights. And I think this is just the top. I don't think this is a real tree. I think this is just the top of a tree that someone hacked off and plopped here. But that doesn't matter. It's real. We put lights on those. We decorate our houses with lights, right? I've gone around and I've seen cars and motorcycles that are all lit up, really kind of cool. Of course, candles. We have candles everywhere. That's a key staple part of Christmas. It's just lights are everywhere. This is not Christmas specifically, but the other weekend, my wife and I were up in Flagstaff. We're out in the forest, and of course the forest is pitch black, right? I mean, there's obviously no lights out there at all. But that particular night, the moon was so bright, it just, everything lit up. We literally went on a bit of a walk and could see that clearly in the forest just from the light coming from the moon. Light is a powerful, powerful thing, right? And the Christmas story is really, the biblical Christmas story is really one that is about light. It's not just that it shows up on Christmas trees and candles. It's that this thing of light is for real. In fact, Jesus says this about himself in John 8:12. You've probably heard this before. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And it wasn't just sort of like a cute cliche thing he was throwing around, right? He really meant it. I am the light of the world. Jesus understood the darkness, right, that we find ourselves in, that we've been singing about and already been hearing about even this morning. He understands the despair and the gloom and the difficulties that we encounter in this life. I know like you, I've experienced and encountered these things, right? Whether it's this disappointment of just knowing that, family relations won't look or be what I would hope or want them to be, or the despair of my own shortcomings, right, in my marriage, and just saying, God, I need your light and hope to shine in here. Right? Or just the pain and the agony of loss that we experience in life and that we encounter. And I know that you know what I'm talking about. I mean, you've experienced all those things in 100 more. I mean, the forms and ways that darkness can come into our lives seem almost endless. And sometimes we sort of bring it on ourselves, right? We do things and we kind of bring our choices bring some darkness on ourselves. And sometimes it just shows up and it's just a part of our lives, because as long as we live in a world that is still broken and not yet fully redeemed, right, darkness will appear. It'll be here with us. And so maybe you are going through a loss of a job. Maybe you have a disease that there is no cure for and you didn't do anything to get. Maybe you just have a depression that just weighs on you, a mental illness that you struggle with. Maybe you have panic attacks from trauma that you experienced years ago, and it just won't seem to go away. And what can you do about it? Jesus understands your darkness and my darkness. He understands your despair and pain and difficulty and gloom and that dark cloud that sometimes just kind of follows us around, right? He understands, but more than understanding it, Jesus begins his public ministry by going to the darkest of places to bring his light. This is really cool. I didn't even quite notice this until just this week as I'm preparing this. So if you have a Bible, turn over to Matthew chapter 4. Again, this is at the very beginning of Jesus's public ministry, right? When he's ready to get out there and get after it. And this is what we read, Matthew 4, verse 12. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and he lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. And we'll get there in a minute. But this is the prophecy that Jesus fulfills. Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Okay, now here it is. The people living in darkness, they have seen a great light. Speaking of himself. On those living in the land, look at this, of the shadow of death. You talk about gloom. A light, a powerful light has dawned on them. Now, why is Galilee, why is that place so gloomy and dark and a land of the shadow of death? Well, one reason is that Galilee is far removed from all the advantages of Jerusalem, right? The temple was in Jerusalem. That was down in Judah. So you have Judah, you have Jerusalem there in Judah. Then you have Samaria up above that. And then Galilee is the furthest away, and God's light brings hope to the furthest, darkest place, this place of Galilee. He begins by going there. So they were the furthest away from all the advantages that you would get in Jerusalem. So it'd be like if you were talking to someone, you said, hey, I live in Arizona. And they said to you, oh, man, that's awesome. I've heard about Arizona. Man, that place is booming. It's like exploding. It's thriving. I mean, the people there, that's crazy. What part do you live in? You say, oh, I live in Florence. Well, all right. Hey, it's judgment-free zone, okay? No problem. But, Florence, it doesn't exactly have the same advantages, right? Of kind of being in the heart of of the city. I don't think there's a Bosa Donuts in Florence. I haven't researched that, but you're gonna be lacking some things, right? Maybe some health benefits or education. Maybe it's a little bit different. And most of all, what's Florence known for? Yeah, some prisons out there, right? Lots of signs. Don't pick up anybody that you see walking around the road. So, it's just far removed, and it doesn't quite have the advantage. But there's an even greater reason of why this area in Galilee that Jesus goes to first, why it is so dark and gloomy, why it is a place of the shadow of death. So flip over to Isaiah. We already saw that this is a prophecy from Isaiah. So if we turn to Isaiah 9, this is where this prophecy comes from. This is what Jesus is quoting from and fulfilling in himself. And in Isaiah 9, verse 1 and 2, we read this. Nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. In the past, he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And what Isaiah is talking about is the fact this was the time in Israel's life when Israel was in rebellion against God. They weren't trusting in Yahweh, the God of Israel, okay? And so God brought judgment upon them through the Assyrians. And Assyria came in and conquered and defeated Israel. And it was an incredibly dark, difficult, hard, gloomy time of death, right? It was a time of judgment for the people of Israel. And because they weren't trusting in and hoping in the God of Israel. They were hoping in other things. They were putting their trust and hope in other things, just not in God. And we read what those other things were in Isaiah 8, just a few verses earlier. In Isaiah 8, verse 22, it says, distressed and hungry, right? They will roam through the land when they are famished. They will become enraged, and they will look upward. They will curse their king and their God. Then they will look toward the earth, and they will see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. And that's what happened. Assyrians came in and conquered them. But do you see what they're hoping in? They're hoping in some weird things. This is a long, long time ago in Isaiah. So it's not exactly the same for us today. So it may seem a bit odd and strange to us, but they were hoping in things like politics, right? I know, crazy. So like they said, you will look to your king. You will look to your king and say, hey, what's going on here? What's the deal, right? And And is it true that maybe that sometimes people put their hope, right, in that if we get the right person in the right seat, then everything will be great. Again, it'll all be good. And maybe part of the reason that we even have so much divisiveness in politics, like in the church, I'm not even talking outside the church, but just in it, maybe is because we put more hope in politics than we should. Another thing that they look to, that they put their hope in, is not just politics, but also religion. So they look to their gods. They instead of trusting in and hoping in Yahweh, the God of Israel, they went to this religion and they said, we'll take a little bit of that religion. And then there's some of this religion over here that we like, and we'll take some of that. And then there's this spiritual thing over here, and I'm gonna take a little bit of that. And then there's this superstitious thing that I like here. And they just sort of made their own religious, like, tossed salad. They're like spiritual potpourri, I like to call it, and that's what they were hoping in, and it didn't work out for them. Again, I know these are weird things that are really foreign to us, that we can't understand and relate to at all, but these are things they're hoping in. Oh, and then the last one that said they will look to the earth, right? They will hope in their own ability to innovate and to create, to have the best of technology and wealth to overcome any other people group or nation or country. And as long as we are the most advanced, then we have nothing to fear from anyone else. And again, it's super weird for us to think about people putting hope in their own ability of innovations to put them ahead of others, or religion or politics. But these were some of the things that they were hoping in instead of trusting in God. And I love how Isaiah says it in verse 17. You can put it up, Isaiah 8:17. Here's what he is putting his hope in, right? And what he's encouraging his people to do: I will wait for the Lord, who's hiding his face from the descendants of Jacob right at that time, but I will put my trust in him. I will continue to look to the promise of light that is to come. And one of our favorite Christmas verses comes a few verses later, and you've seen it, or you will see it when you get Christmas cards from your friends and family. Isaiah 9:6, for to us a child is born, and to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah is putting his hope and his trust in the promise of light that will come. And Jesus shows up in Matthew, where we started. Jesus shows up in Matthew, and he goes to this place, Galilee, this place of darkness, this shadow of death, right? Where they experienced great pain and gloom and suffering. And he says, this prophecy in Isaiah, it's fulfilled. Light is here. I am here. Light has dawned upon you. Light has come. Will you put your hope in me? And that's really the question that I have for you today in all of this, right? We know our own darkness. We know the disappointments and the pain, and we know our failures. We know all those things. The question is, like Isaiah, will you trust God with the darkest things in your life? Will you trust God with the darkest things in your life, believing that Jesus began his public ministry? He started in the first place he went to was the darkest place. The first place he said, I'm going to go to is this land of Galilee that has lived in deep, deep darkness. And I'm going to go there, and the promised light of the world is going to shine in that place. Will you trust God with your deepest, darkest areas of your life? Right? These are the things, I mean, if you think about these things in your life, right? Maybe it's heavy doubts that you have, or confusion that weighs you down. Maybe it's your own sense of failure, of not being able to do what you need or should do. Maybe it's your own sense of, well, I never measure up. Maybe it's this relationship that you just can't get right. Maybe it's just a state of depression that you're in, that's just this thing that's weighing on you. Maybe it's something you've kind of stepped into and brought on yourself, or maybe it's something that just you found yourself in. But will you trust God with that? Because here's the thing, this is what's so cool, is that the darkest things in your life, in my life, they scare us, don't they? I mean, if we're being honest, if you're being honest, the darkest things in your life, whatever that is, it can keep you up at night. It can scare you. But it doesn't scare God at all. Isn't that awesome? He chooses to go to the darkest place. Doesn't scare him at all. It scares us. But good news, God's not afraid of the dark. Who knew? Right? I mean, when you were a kid, you were afraid of the dark. You didn't like that place. Maybe now you still have a little light. Hey, judgment, no problem. Hey, it's good. I'm good. It's cool. You like to have a little light on. God's not afraid of the dark. So whatever this thing is that's weighing you down, whatever this thing is that you're carrying that's dark and it's ugly, it's heavy, you can give it to him. It's not going to scare God away, right? And he's big enough. He's big enough to take it on. I mean, sometimes we find ourselves, right, in a deep, dark cave that we couldn't find our way out of if we wanted to, if we tried. It's just way too big for you or I to handle. Way too big for us to figure out up from down, right from left, where the exit door is. But it's not too big for God. God's light is big enough and bright enough to go into your deepest, darkest cave and bring you out. Pretty awesome. So when we think of the darkness that we have and these places that we find ourselves in, as difficult as they may be, it's not just that. I mean, yes, God's big enough and he's not scared of these things, but this darkness that you're carrying or that you're feeling, and like Dre said earlier, like the holidays, sometimes these are the hardest, darkest times for people, right? But this is not the end for you. The darkness that you may be in, it is not the end of your story. It's not the end of the road for you, right? The promise of light is for you. My oldest son, Hayden, is in the Navy, and for part of his training, one of the things that he had to do was he just had a really difficult week. It was really hard. And during this whole week, it was just constant, run and swim and all these physical demands, and you're just going. And then, it was in the San Diego area, so they're out, get in the water, get soaking wet, so you're freezing and you're cold, and then there's sand all over. I mean, you feel miserable, you're chafing all over the place. It's a horrible, painful experience. Then at the end of the day, though, you would just keep going. Right? There was sleep deprivation was part of the whole deal. And so he said out of that week, there was like 1, maybe 2 days where they got 2 hours of sleep. That's it. So you're just going. And then it's just at the end of the day, you're exhausted. And then it's like, hey, why don't you go ahead and get in that boat and just spend all night rowing, right, around the harbor, the pier. I mean, it's nonstop. And he said the worst, or one of the worst parts of it is at the end of the day, when darkness sets in, when the night comes, and we got to keep doing this all night long. And he said, you're just waiting. You're waiting, right, for the sun to come up, for the sun to rise. And when the sun started to rise, it's like, first of all, just the tiny little glimmer of warmth that you get from the sun, even though he's soaking wet, freezing, just a little bit of warmth from the sun, it just feels so good. Right? It's so, and the fact that, of course, the darkness is gone because the sun's come up now and you can actually see, like mentally, right? It's healing. It just lifts your spirits, right? I mean, we've all been there, right? And you just feel so much like, oh, light has come. But the most significant part about it was him knowing I made it to the next day, right? That this darkness in my life wasn't the end of me. I made it through the night. I made it through the darkness. And your darkness is not the end for you. So, I mean, what if God's light is really bright enough to dispel your greatest darkness? What if it is? What if God's grace is big enough to take on your worst failure? What if it's true that God has already gone to the deepest, darkest place, that he has already gone and taken on sin and darkness and death itself, and has come back from it so that he can raise you up and pull you and fill you with his light? Would you trust him with just the darkest, hardest things you're facing right now? Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will not walk in darkness. Instead, you will have the light of life. So would you just bow your heads with me? And I just want to give you a brief moment in this space right now. Just be where your feet are. And would you just give God the darkness that's weighing on you, the gloom, the weight that's hovering over you, the thing that scares you, but it doesn't scare him, the thing that feels way too big for you, but it's really small for him. Jesus, we give you our whole selves, and especially these dark places. And God, we thank you for your promise of light that has come, and we just ask that you would shine again in our lives, that you would bring your light to the places where we need it the most, right now. God, would you fill us with your hope and your grace, your goodness and your kindness. May we receive your light right now, Jesus. We pray in your name. Amen.